I begin at this point in time to introduce the panel, Sepsis is a Devastating Disease. Listen to Survivors and Those Bereaved. My name is Ray Schachter. I'm in Vancouver, Canada, and have the privilege of moderating this panel of 5 people whose lives have been profoundly affected by sepsis. I became involved with the Global Sepsis Alliance about 4 years ago, and am a member of the executive committee. GSA organizes this Congress. I am a survivor, having fallen mortally ill with sepsis in 1996, and I defied the odds by surviving. I've told my personal story many times to educate the public and health providers about sepsis and its consequences. The people you're about to hear from will tell their stories, their struggles to cope with the consequences of sepsis, both short and long term, and their personal contributions and commitments to sepsis awareness, treatment, and prevention. Our panel members will speak in the order of the program information. I will provide only the briefest of details and let them take it from there. Each panelist will have approximately 12 minutes to present and can then answer questions which you can send to me on the chat line. We will limit the questions after each talk, but come back to them at the end of the session, time permitting. Please send your questions on the chat line and I will direct them to the panelists. Our panelists will speak together at the end of all of the sections. And with that, I would like to introduce the first panelist to tell his story. Carl Flatley, a retired dentist from Richmond, Indiana originally, now living in Florida. In 2002, Carl lost his daughter Erin at age 23 to sepsis. Since that time, Carl has been a major contributor to various sepsis campaigns, and in fact, Carl founded the Sepsis Alliance, which has been so active in the United States in promoting and advocating prevention and treatment of sepsis and legislative changes. Carl, I now invite you to tell your story.
First, I'd like to thank the WHO and Global Sepsis Alliance for hosting this conference. When I started the Sepsis Alliance 15 years ago, if you put the word sepsis in an email, it got flagged as a misspelling. Now, here we are 15 years later, we're on a conversation on our phone with people around the world. This just kind of blows me away, but thanks everyone. So in 2002, I did lose my daughter, Erin, and it was after a routine hemorrhoidectomy. And she died from septic shock and medical malpractice. We spent 3 years in litigation, and it was a horrible thing to go through. And I can tell you the experience of losing a child, time does not heal the pain. Secondly, she's not in a better place. And last, there is no closure for someone who loses a child, none at all. And since Erin died, 4.5 million others in the United States have died since her death. I find that inexcusable. I mean, shame on all of us, but we are making change. What I'd like to highlight are those people who survived. There are 10.5 million survivors during this same 15-year period. We are getting better at reducing mortality, but I don't think we're doing a good enough job addressing those that survive. Along with the 38 amputations daily in the U.S., organ dysfunctions, cognitive deficiencies, many suffer from post-sepsis syndrome. I belong to 7 or 8 different support groups. I've had sepsis myself, but I have no issues. But I get on to see if I can help other people. And these people are struggling, and they talk about trying to get help and having their doctors understand them. And their family doesn't understand them. And it's a horrible thing to go through. So I think we need to have the same endeavor as we have in reducing the mortality, is take care of those survivors. I mean, we are getting a good handle on the physical burden of sepsis, I don't think we have a good handle on the emotional toll of the people that survive sepsis with amputations, cognitive function, and all the other things. And it can't be calculated. I mean, the pain, the misery, is just, it's horrible. We all know it because that's why we're doing what we're doing. So sepsis truly is a blanket of death, disability, and despair. And I just want to thank everyone on this call and those listening for what you're doing. And we just got to keep up the fight with doing things like this. So thank you very much, and I'll stand by. Thank you.
Carl, could you perhaps just expand on your public advocacy and what you've accomplished over the past decade and a half through the Sepsis Alliance and elsewhere?
Yeah, so we've come a long way. When I started, I had my retirement plan and one sponsor. We've got 24 national sponsors now. We do everything from billboards across the United States to webinars to we have Sepsis Heroes this Thursday. We're meeting with DARPA and Congress in Chicago in a couple of days. We've got a very active board, probably to 25 members. None of them are paid. No one gets reimbursed. These are all dedicated people. And so it has not been me that have done this. It's the people that have come on board. And I just can't tell you the different partnerships we're in, working with other groups and hospitals and states. I mean, it's hard to keep up. So the contributions make it happen, and we're doing well, and we're going to continue to grow. I couldn't be more pleased with where we are right now. Thanks for asking.
Carl, I was wondering, you mentioned medical malpractice and litigation, and that was part of my battle as well. I was misdiagnosed in 1996. Aaron passed in 2002. Have you any observations on whether the medical community, there would be less malpractice or concerns about misdiagnosis today than there were in 2002?
Well, I think first they've got to be forthcoming and they've got to speak up. When we lost Erin, not one doctor spoke to me from that day. They didn't even come out and tell me she died. They sent a nurse. Then they surrounded the wagon. So it was that time where there were no apologies. I never had any physician tell me they were sorry for the outcome. I mean, they didn't have to say they did something wrong, which they did, but no one even said they were sorry for the outcome. I think you've got to be upfront with the patients. They're very smart these days, and you can't just bull over them. And I mean, it's a devastating thing to lose a child, and you just want answers. And they didn't talk. They didn't talk, and it took 3 years, $500,000 to get to court and get it settled. It's a travesty. Everybody lost. No one won. So I think we just have to have better communication between the patients and the healthcare providers. That would help. Yes.
I also know that you've been a great contributor to the Global Sepsis Alliance and the awards we give out every year. And I prefer, actually, Carl, if you could speak about that to our audience rather than me. Can you do so?
Yeah, so I guess I've been doing it for 3 or 4 years now, and we've created the Global Sepsis Awards. I met Dr. Reinhardt years ago, probably 15 years ago, because when I lost Aaron, I truly ran around the world trying to figure out who knows anything about this, and no one did. Went to CDC, NIH, all this. And it's such a loss when you lose your child that you want them to be remembered. And I wanted the world to remember Aaron. She's made a difference. So they've been very well received, and it highlights the effort of different countries, institutions, physicians. CDC was honored this year. They've done a tremendous job. So I think they're a very important award, and I plan on continuing that effort for Aaron.
And I'd like to thank you publicly on behalf of GSA for your contributions. Do you have I'm sure you've had a chance to look at the experiences of our other panelists. Do you have anything you'd like to add about their experiences or have them respond to when they give their presentations following you?
Well, we're all in it together. I mean, we all suffer in different ways. But I think when I see, we have Face to Sepsis on our website. We have over 1,000 victims on there, and there's a thread that runs through there, and it's early recognition. And it's got to be done by the patient also, not just the physician. 87% of sepsis cases start in the communities. If the patient doesn't get to the hospital in a timely manner, the physician has little chance of getting a good outcome. So that's what we've seen with our 1,000 people that have filled out our Face to Sepsis, that it's that early recognition, and they've got to get there first. It's on them. So we need public awareness very badly. And then once they get to the hospital, we need everybody on board, not just a few champion doctors. We need every staff, every member of pharmacists, the entire team. So I think the other panelists will speak to that also. I think they'll feel the same. The other panelists will also comment on the emotional and physical toll of survivors. We know the impact on families of like yours who have lost a person. But just speaking for myself, I believe that the physical toll and emotional toll carries on for decades, and this is just really beginning to be understood. Do you have any thoughts on that, Carl? Well, it does go on for decades, and I think it changed your whole life. They talk about the new normal, and I've got friends who've survived, and they're not the same. I've had sepsis, I have no issues, but even losing a child, it affects you forever. So I don't think anyone gets over it. I mean, I was lucky not to have any issues, but that's only half of them. 50% of the survivors have issues, and few of them get over it. It's just a new normal. They have to deal with it, and it's horrible, and a lot of other people don't understand. So they're in a vacuum for a long time. It's God bless them for hanging on, because when you lose a child, I think if you only had one, you might commit suicide. It's that heavy, and you see people who struggle with these post-sepsis things. They're desperate. They're looking for help, and we need to be there for them. Yes.
Thanks, Carl. I think we'll be coming back at the end to more questions, and I'd like to turn to the next participant. Thank you very much, Carl, for your presentation and your continuing help. It's been so important to this Congress and also to the Global Sepsis Alliance.
You're welcome, Ray. Thank you.
So I'd like to introduce you to Fiona Gray, who in 2014 was a very healthy young woman, having just given birth to her daughter. 8 months later, she felt, quote, sicker than I'd ever felt before. And I quote this from her story found on the GSA website and online, because that specific comment applies to so many people who have suffered from sepsis or who have seen their family members stricken with sepsis. It is understood by the patient that they felt sicker than ever before, but not really understood by the healthcare providers, who, in my view, have to listen more carefully. Fortunately, Fiona survived and will tell you her story and how she later became involved in advocating for better knowledge and awareness of sepsis and quality care. In addition to her own experience, Fiona, can you also tell us about your connection with the Australian Sepsis Network? So I'll turn it over to you, Fiona.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction, Raymond. Also, just want to say thank you so much to Carl for his contribution. I'm so grateful for all of the advocacy work he does and has done. He's inspirational. Before I get into a bit of my story, I guess want to paint a bit of a picture about what's led me to be so passionate about sepsis awareness. I mean, obviously, my own experience 3 years ago septic shock. It ignite that fire in my belly to, and I will talk a bit more about how that came about. But I think that whilst going along this journey and really learning about the burden of sepsis, not only in Australia but around the world, I think the thing that's really affected me the most and has really inspired me, but also fueled me from, I guess, an anger, a place of anger, is when I hear about people that don't survive, or people that are left with long-term side effects. As you mentioned, you know, I'm relatively okay post-septic shock, but in particular, I want to acknowledge the children that don't survive sepsis, and I'd really like to acknowledge two families in Australia, the families of Thomas Snell, and sorry for getting emotional, and also Maddie Jones. As a parent, I cannot even begin to imagine what they've gone through, and I'm so grateful for the work that they're now doing in memory of their beautiful children to create better awareness. So my story, what I really want to focus on is about saying the word sepsis. So if I look back on my experience, the word sepsis was not mentioned from the ED through to the ward, ICU, and at discharge, not mentioned at all. So I had a follow-up with my GP probably about a week or so after discharge. Sepsis, again, not mentioned. I think the main focus with my GP was, you know, she let me know, gee, you've been through a really big deal. It was pretty serious what happened, but, you know, she made sure that I knew to take my ongoing oral antibiotics. And the main thing that she wanted me to ensure that I did after that appointment was have my 3-month chest x-ray, because I'd also had hospital-acquired pneumonia. And I just remember walking out of her office thinking, right, I've got to make sure I get this chest x-ray. So as far as I knew, I just had a really bad infection in my arm, and I just needed to, you know, take a couple of weeks to get over it and get back to work. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. So after days and weeks, I'm starting to think, why am I not feeling better? Why am I not getting quickly enough? I had suffered from anxiety previously in my life, but the anxiety that I was now suffering post-sepsis was different. I was having a lot more trouble. My brain wasn't functioning the same. It's funny. I used to have to, particularly in the months, probably the first 12 to 18 months post septic shock, I'd have to describe things to my husband. I'd have to say, if I wanted him to pass me a glass of water, I'd have to say that thing that holds the water in it, and I couldn't think what the word glass was. So things like that. And the reason I laughed before and said it's funny is that 3 years out now, I'm a lot better in that side of things. However, when I get tired, and it is nearly 2 a.m. in the morning here, so I'm struggling a bit with my words tonight, but I am a lot better. I had slight hair loss, I had exhaustion, and the real thing that was impacting me was this guilt for not being able to return to work sooner. In fact, I did return to work a lot sooner than I should have, because as far as I knew, I had an infected arm. I do, as part of my job, I spend a lot of time out on the road in my car visiting clients. So my discussions with my employer were, because my infection was in my arm, sorry I didn't mention that, my employer and I discussed about when will I be back at work, when am I right to drive is really what our focus was, nothing about anything else. So that real, sense of being alone and not understanding why I wasn't getting better, and I really just felt like maybe I'm a hypochondriac. Maybe I'm, my daughter's 10 months old. Maybe this is what you feel like when you work and you're a mum. Maybe I do just need to just get on with it and stop feeling sorry for myself. But it just wasn't getting better. So one evening I pulled out my discharge letter that I'd received from the hospital, and I read the headline at the top, and it said septic shock requiring inotropic support. So I decided to turn to the internet to try and work out what that was, and that's what led me to discover the word sepsis for the first time in my life. And from there, I found websites like the Global Sepsis Alliance, the Sepsis Alliance in the US, which you made reference, Raymond, to my story that was published there. That was probably, I think, within 6 months of my experience. Also the UK Sepsis Trust, and then eventually the Australian Sepsis Network. From there, I also found, Carl touched on this, I found Facebook support groups, which there are several, and they were a real godsend to me. I think that perhaps I wouldn't have made it through that first 12 to 18 months without those online support groups, because otherwise I had no support. Through one of the ladies that I met on one of the support groups, she could see that I was really searching or seeking out for how can we make a difference. I need to change this. I can't sit back and just let the same thing happen to me. I can't keep hearing about, people losing loved ones, people suffering. She sent me a message and suggested that I jump on Twitter because she said more medical professionals are on Twitter, and you might be able to you might find more assistance with advocacy with Twitter. So I did, and that was probably 18 months or so ago now. And I am very active on Twitter, and I do get a lot of good information on Twitter. I also, as part of all of that, found that there was a gap for Australia and New Zealand. We didn't have any support groups, so I started the Australia and New Zealand sepsis support group for survivors that live in Australia and New Zealand. So that's a bit of an overview of, I guess, that real sense of sepsis not being explained. As I said, right from me arriving at the emergency department right through to post-sepsis. And it really was a journey of me discovering it for myself, and then finding those other mechanisms for support. So what would have helped? What would I have liked to have been done differently? I think, and Carl again touched on this, and I think it's so important, is that having an understanding of sepsis prior to it happening. Had I known what it was, perhaps I would have, maybe asked an extra question when I was sitting in emergency department, which I spent 12 hours in, and perhaps it might have been a poster on the wall. If I look at the sepsis awareness posters that we've got available now, I had the majority of those symptoms. They were classic symptoms, and it perhaps would have made me know to speak up more about what I was experiencing, as opposed to just placing 100% reliance on the observations that the medical professionals are making. I think information, once I was in ICU, information about exactly what I'd been through and what I would experience, information for my family by way of information pamphlets. Same in the ward, and at discharge we were sent home with nothing. And then I think I don't know what the different healthcare systems have around the world, but in Australia, for example, I would love to see the hospital liaising better with GPs, and there being a better handover, so that that care post-sepsis is handled in a better way, and then also other services. You can be referred to other services, whether it be support services as far as counselling, or all the various different things that survivors experience post-sepsis. So, and I think that clearly there's my GP didn't even mention the word sepsis either, and she, it would have been great to see her offer some, I guess, advice or referrals to other support services, which there was none. So that pretty much wraps up for what I wanted to touch on.
I'm a little surprised that you only heard about sepsis when you read the reports after your discharge. And I was wondering if you ever went back and spoke to your medical healthcare providers, either your GP or at the hospital, and asked them about why they had not provided you with this information specifically and given you more information about the help you needed on discharge.
That's an interesting question. I absolutely did. I wrote a letter to the hospital, which was an overwhelmingly positive letter, mostly thanking them for saving my life. I did have a couple of questions because, post-discharge I had found out about sepsis, so I had a couple of questions that were sepsis related. But as I said, overwhelmingly it was a positive letter, and I also let them know about the fact that I was now involved with advocacy about sepsis, and I asked them how I can work with them to, create better awareness and listed off a few ideas. I received a really disappointing letter. It was quite hurtful, actually. I think that the two minor questions I asked, which I'll tell you, the first question I asked was I treated for sepsis? And the answer came back, yes, you were. And the second question was, at what point did I receive broad-spectrum antibiotics? They didn't answer that question, but overwhelmingly the response was quite negative, and they didn't even acknowledge my interest in creating awareness or perhaps changing the way they do things.
And have you noticed, or do you feel that there's been any advances or improvement in this since you've been advocating for sepsis awareness?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, I mentioned Twitter earlier, and I had a really fantastic experience several weeks ago. I had a couple of nurses from not the hospital I was treated at, but another one local to me, contact me via Twitter and apologise for stalking me, as they said, which I said to them they absolutely don't need to worry about that, but they said they'd been following me on Twitter for a while and were really interested in the advocacy work I do about sepsis. And I'm actually spending World Sepsis Day with them and their team, where we're doing an IQ session where they're reviewing my experience as a case study. And then I'll also be presenting after that from a patient perspective. So it's not the hospital I was treated at, but it's a start in my home state. And, if you had have asked me a few months ago if I was ever going to see something like that local to where I live, I would have said, I don't think it's possible. So, yes, things are definitely improving and changing.
Thanks very much, Fiona. I think we can possibly give a little more time to you and others, as one of the guests has not been able to contact us yet. I just will make a comment before moving on to Idelette Nutma-Bade, and that is that cognitive dysfunctions and the long-term effect on mental ability is something which has been caused by sepsis or is correlated with people who have suffered from sepsis, is being studied today. And I'm not sure what the results have been. Perhaps some of the previous panel members and the other sessions have commented on this, but your cognitive problems are something I've certainly heard many times from sepsis patients.
Absolutely, yeah. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, Fiona, that again, thank you so much for being on the panel and your contributions in Australia and to sepsis awareness generally, and I wish you good health and a long life of contribution to our cause.
Thank you, Raymond.
So I'd like to move on now to the next panelist, Idelette Nutma-Bade. Her story began to unfold in 2007 when she experienced, in her own words, the thin line between life and death caused by sepsis. She fell ill due to septic shock, spent 5 days in ICU. Her story is eerily similar to my own, and in that she saw in the space of a few days or a few hours' time that she went into shock, developed acute respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS, which I'm sure the audience is very familiar with. Her family was informed that it could go either way, leaving them between hope and fear. When I was in ICU, unconscious of course, one doctor said there was no hope, and another said, I have seen people in his condition survive. I can assure you that my family responded better to the latter. Idelette has many important observations on the recovery process and continuing effects, that is the sequelae of sepsis. With that, I turn it over to you, Idelette, to tell us your story.
Thank you so much, Ray, and for making this possible, all of you, the Global Sepsis Alliance, and so many people involved. There's so much hunger for recognition and sharing. It really moves me to be part of this today. Yes, I was in a critical condition back in 2007, and I had a near-death experience, which I find difficult to put into words, but fortunately, thank God, I turned the corner after having been ventilated for a few days. Sepsis strikes like lightning, without warning, seeming to resemble the flu, and imposing a burden on your loved ones as well. In 2009, I went back to the ICU together with my 9-year-old daughter to see the place where I had struggled with my critical illness. The impact on your loved ones is huge, and that doesn't end with leaving the hospital. I want to go back to that morning. Just before ICU admission, antibiotic IV treatment because of pneumonia had already been started. And I tried to make sense of it all. How did my body lose control? And it really felt like some supernatural force was pushing me over the edge. And it started with dizziness when walking to the toilet, and soon it felt like my legs went wobbly. So for me, the dizziness was actually the first sign sounding the alarm that something was really wrong. And I made it back to bed just in time and called for the nurse, and it became clear that I had a very low blood pressure. And shortly after that, my feet and hands had turned ice cold, and I felt my heart pounding, beating very fast. And being a nurse, at the time I realized that I was going into shock. And in less than 15 minutes, my shortness of breath worsened, and as I coughed, my mouth filled with bloody mucus and fluid. And for a moment, I was really caught by the very fear of dying. And I thank God there was an ICU to turn to. It saved my life, really. And afterwards, it turned out I had signs of a hantavirus infection in my blood. So, thank God I survived, but sepsis nearly killed me. And just like Fiona experienced, my well, I never heard anyone mention the word sepsis. Not until a few months after my discharge, I noticed the word sepsis in my medical record. During my nursing education, the word had only been mentioned with regard to a complication of a wound infection or a peritonitis, but never ever had it been referred to as this systemic host response or organ dysfunction that was making my body react in this life-threatening way. And as I said earlier, sepsis really caught me by surprise. And I think lots of patients don't realize what hit them because just like me, they were never informed. So hence it became my mission to communicate about sepsis and to literally spread the word. And I want to mention something very important, that even when patients are not admitted to the ICU, sepsis remains a critical illness. Actually, it seems to be the most common critical illness outside the ICU. Also, because it is often not promptly diagnosed at the general ward. And I think when it comes to consistent compliance of protocols and alertness, a lot of work still has to be done in hospitals and other settings in the Netherlands, but in the rest of the world as well. And I'd like to take a closer look right now at the recovery period and my mission, which turned eventually into a very fulfilling job. During my recovery, I often experienced loneliness. Although I had the full support from my family and friends, but no doctor seemed equipped to give me advice about my recovery. No one told me what to expect. No one told me that it was normal to feel depressed at times. No one told me that sequelae like lack of concentration and problems with your short-time memory can linger on. And I want to emphasize that I'm very, very grateful that I didn't lose limbs like many other patients did, and that my organs weren't damaged that much. But my recovery took me a long time with a lot of readmissions, and I had to quit my original job. Now, being a nurse, that impact of sepsis triggered me. So after my illness, I decided to bring all the information about sepsis and its sequelae together in a book in Dutch called Septische Shock, followed by a second book in 2016, also translated in English, that was called Sepsis and Afterwards. Really to serve as a guide for other survivors and their relatives. And for that same reason, I initiated the Dutch website Sepsis en Daarna, which means sepsis and afterwards. I joined the movement of family and patient-centered intensive care, educating people about PICS, the post-intensive care syndrome, and focusing on how can we reduce the impact of an intensive care stay. And I started providing guidance to patients recovering from sepsis and teaching nurses about the long-term effects of sepsis. I'd really like to put the spotlight on that, those long-term effects of sepsis and the lack of aftercare. I put my heart and soul into this. I'm convinced that the development of expertise on sequelae after sepsis is really necessary. In my work, I meet a lot of patients facing long-term problems that need to be more explored and addressed. Examples are the neurocognitive deficits, as well as the problems with neuropathy and sepsis being a trigger for all kinds of other issues like autoimmune diseases and even disturbances like autonomic dysfunction. And especially after a longer time, when patients develop all kinds of physical and mental complaints, there is no specialist they can turn to. Actually, they are in no man's land. A multidisciplinary research center specialized in sepsis sequelae would really be a major step forward. So we can eventually support survivors with tailor-made aftercare. Especially those who weren't in the ICU often don't get rehab, although they have been critically ill and often suffer from brain damage. And that's one of the reasons I also started organizing the workshop Recovering After Sepsis, not only to offer them a chance to meet each other, but also to give former patients tips about good nutrition, brain training, dietary supplements, which I found to be very helpful myself, to build up trust in your body again. And complementary medicine really made a difference for me. It increased my energy level, my concentration, and really lowered my susceptibility to infections, thus preventing further readmissions. Now, I'd like to close with two more things as signs of hope. First is the Dutch national petition, SOS for Sepsis. Recently, with a group of people affected by sepsis, one of which lost both her lower legs due to sepsis, we handed over a petition to members of the House of Representatives named SOS for Sepsis, stating that the public awareness regarding sepsis in the Netherlands is dramatically low and that unnecessary damage and suffering are the consequences. Professor Dr. Peter Pickers, known for his sepsis research, he was also a speaker today, was also present to support us. And as a result, a third meeting with the Ministry of Healthcare is scheduled on the 17th of September. So we're very happy with that. And we hope to organize a sepsis conference in the near future and give really a boost to the public sepsis awareness. Also on the 29th of September, we have a first Dutch sepsis peer meeting. The last thing is about my personal motivation. My own illness was a wake-up call. But there's one other reason why I'm so devoted to this fight against sepsis. In 2015, we lost our 15-year-old daughter to a brain hemorrhage, but there was absolutely nothing we could have done to prevent it from happening. We were powerless. Now that inspires me to focus on sepsis, because in many cases we can prevent it or at least intervene earlier. So let's do together what we need to do in order to save the lives we can. I thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Idelette. That's very inspiring. It strikes me as so interesting that with your nursing education and background, you knew so little about sepsis, but that too is not an unusual story. I've interviewed people and done presentations with a nurse in Canada who also did not recognize their own symptoms. I'm just going to say that building up trust in your body is so important. I'm not sure that it's a different paradigm when you have sepsis. and your body has completely let you down. And then you have to deal with sequelae, and it's a new life afterwards. I think Carl has also mentioned that, although in a different context. So I think we're a little short on time. There'll be a question and answer afterwards. And thank you so much for your inspired thoughts and deeds. So we're going to move on to Elkhatim Elyas Mohamed from Sudan. Dr. Mohamed has also suffered from sepsis, and will be interested, I'm sure, in hearing his story about how that occurred and the results of it. He's a renowned consultant chest physician in Sudan, and a national figure and campaigner and advocate for healthcare in his country. He's also participated with the World Health Organization, and any of you can go to the program for the Congress and see his background. I have personally spoken with and read about many health professionals who failed to diagnose their own condition of sepsis, going back to my comments about nurses. And I'd like to turn it over to you, Dr. Mohamed, and thank you so much for coming and visiting with us on this panel.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I'm going to tell my story, but first of all, I would like to thank the speaker before me and pick up some of the key words which she has mentioned, that there's always hope. We have to rely on early prevention, and we have to learn from our mistakes. So this about my story. I developed a cardiac event, went to the ER, very well controlled, IV lines were inserted and so on. Things went on very well till the third day after an angiography, went there very smoothly, and then I was transferred to a room in the ward. That's on the third day after lines were inserted. So on that day morning, I felt very, very abnormal fatigue. I couldn't even read the papers. I couldn't toss from side to side. I couldn't sit up on the chair. And then about dinner time, off my food. I have no appetite at all. And in the evening, I had some shivering, told the nurse who related to the doctor, and he asked blood field for malaria and CBC. And I noticed that there was a swelling at the sides of the cannula. So I told the nurse to remove the cannula, and I told her this is not about CBC or blood field for malaria, it's about something else. That information was relayed to the doctor, who instructed to prescribe antibiotics. That was the third day. Following morning, the fourth day, very high fever, vomiting, about 9:30 in the morning. At about 11 o'clock, I was talking to my wife, and then I lost consciousness. Complete loss of consciousness. In the evening, about 9 in the evening, I found myself in another hospital. I could recognize the hospital, surrounded by friends. Most of them were doctors, and I opened my eyes, and all of them, thank God, and so you are well. I looked at the monitor. I found my blood pressure was 64/46. That's when I became well. And I knew that I was in septic shock. My wife told me later that she was talking to me, and suddenly I switched off. My eyes were gazing at the ceiling, and she raised my hand, which I couldn't hold my hands up, and she knew that something serious was going on. She called to my friends, lifelong friends who were doctors, and they came running. And after that, I spent a few days in the hospital, in the ICU, very well looked after, giving supportive treatment, giving the appropriate antimicrobials and so on. And there were no serious or significant post-sepsis problems apart from fatigue, intense for about 2 weeks. I was unable to go to work. I tried, but I couldn't. So we know that to prevent sepsis, we have to intervene early. But to intervene early, we have to know when to intervene. And I think that the criteria for intervention, that's pulse and blood pressure and fever and so on, if we wait for those as criteria for intervention, then that's too late. Because when I developed all those symptoms, I was only about 2.5 hours from the septic shock. So what should we do? Fatigue, often overlooked by doctors. What I think are very important symptoms: loss of appetite, shivering, disturbed sleep on and off with bad dreams. So treatment was started actually 24 hours later than it should have been started. When I had that fatigue and shivering and loss of appetite, I think that was the intervention time if you're going to have successful treatment of for sepsis. Early intervention, which means that early recognition, which means that we have to inquire about symptoms on a daily basis. And just like temperature, blood pressure, and so on. And secondly, we have to have daily inspection for every line inserted. Often these lines are neglected, covered by plasters and so on, and nobody knows what's going beneath those covers. There might have been a swelling, there might have been and so on. Actually, I only observed the swelling when it was very visible. And as you could see it in the picture, if you have it in front of you, that was the second morning. It was not visible unless one is particularly looking for signs of sepsis, that swelling, that pain, that redness, that thrombophlebitis, and so on. So what I hope and what I request, we have to revise our criteria for intervention. I'm a very senior doctor, very senior people came to look after me, but I think if somebody else, right, who doesn't have, let us say, the connections, the situation would have been different. And the second thing is we have to, in our countries, we have to raise it high up on the agenda as a national problem. It is a national problem because in our country, according to statistics, it is number 2 cause of mortality in our hospitals. So we need measurement, good measurement, causes, interventions regarding symptoms, criteria for intervention. We know that if we diagnose sepsis, we have to do within the first hour, right? But I was given started treatment after 24 hours or 25 hours. So these were the mistakes, and doctors almost have treatment. I mean, training on so many CPR, so on and so on and so on. And I think combating sepsis should be one of the mandatory training programs for all medical professions and health teams that are involved to deal with infection and sepsis. Because it's a killer. It's one of the important killers, unfortunately, in our institutions, which actually should be the institutions to help them. I was saved from myocardial infarction. I could have been lost because of sepsis. So why are we having these hospitals and institutions? And these are the lessons which I learned from my experience. And you have got, that was a very, very severe infection. If you look at my hand, that was the 4th day. And that was the site of the cannula, as if it was punctured by a professional operators. All that could have been prevented. The sad thing. Thank you very much. If there are any questions.
Thanks so much, Dr. Mohamed, or Elkhatim, if I can call you that. I think a couple of the things you've said have really resonated with me, and one of them is that even a trained, highly trained physician such as yourself becomes completely vulnerable when you're really stricken with a serious illness. So vulnerable that I think even you did not recognize the symptoms of sepsis until it was almost too late. Do you have any thoughts on the vulnerability of patients?
Yes, I think so. Even I couldn't recognize the symptoms. I was wondering what was happening. Now I said, "Oh, you are not your normal self. What's going on?" But I didn't know what was going on.
Well, that possibly could have been because of cognitive dysfunction, which is the side effect, maybe low oxygen levels, low blood pressure. You're just not able to think the way you normally would. Had you been the diagnostic physician, you would have looked at it completely differently.
Sure. That's why I think it needs special training.
And I think that, at least in my case, when I tried to point out to the emergency doctor the seriousness of my illness, and I was ignored, I was too vulnerable and too weak to really put up a fight. And the other observation I have is the lessons learned, and how I often felt I would have liked to learn those lessons, perhaps watching someone else rather than experiencing them myself. They are very hard lessons to learn, and I think what you've said really indicates that we have to learn these lessons now. We can't wait till either we ourselves or a family member suffers from sepsis. We have to be proactive, and I think that's the message we've heard from everyone on the panel thus far. So, do you have any further observations, or can we move on to our last speaker and then come back to a full discussion perhaps afterwards? Elkhatim, anything further you would like to tell us?
Doctors and nurses as well, I think that they are not well aware enough of the development of sepsis, and even when there are signs, they look at it as a peripheral, not central issue. So it has to be put high on the agenda. That's by special training and by highlighting the problems. That's what's happening now.
And that's the focus of our efforts through GSA, and I know in many hospitals throughout the world now, thanks to the medical healthcare providers and volunteers and people who are participating. I'd like to turn to our last panelist, and that is Peter Wilkinson from Brisbane, Australia. He and his wife, Amy, have a beautiful daughter, Mia, now 5, who just last year was a healthy, happy, active 4-year-old. But in October 2017, Mia became devastatingly sick with sepsis. In only 48 hours, the illness stopped her heart. She was put on life support, and the consequences were dire. She actually lost both her hands and her feet and will live the rest of her life as a quad amputee. There's an inspiring video which is available online about how Mia has progressed, and of course about Peter and Amy, her parents. But Mia is only one of 18,000 Australians who are diagnosed with sepsis annually. Again, and I'm going to let Peter, of course, tell his story, but the quote from the material online is, "On Saturday, Mia woke up sicker than her parents had ever seen her." Again, the same refrain, sicker than ever. There's something completely unusual and not right going on. And this is unfortunately many times overlooked by healthcare providers. So with that, Peter, may I turn it over to you to tell us your story and the story of Mia?
Thank you, Raymond. Thank you everyone for the opportunity to speak today and to talk a little bit about our story. My name is Peter Wilkinson, and if you had asked me a year ago if I thought I was lucky, I would have quickly answered yes. I have a beautiful wife, Amy, and 3 wonderful children, Ellie, Mia, and Max. If you ask me the same question today, the answer is a bit more complicated. And the reason it's more complicated is sepsis. On October 13, in 2017, my 4-year-old daughter, Mia, spent the morning playing happily with her cousins. In the afternoon, she complained of a sore belly, and by the evening, she was throwing up and running a high fever. Mia was ill throughout the night. Her fever was higher than we had seen before, and she seemed lethargic. Our children had been sick before, but as Raymond said, this time seemed unusual. So in the morning, we took Mia to see a GP. Mia didn't want to walk, so Amy took her in a stroller. We were told Mia most likely had gastro. We were given a prescription for anti-nausea tablets and sent home with advice to give her fluids and rest. We set Mia up in front of the TV and checked on her through the day. In the afternoon, Amy went to check on Mia, and while she was awake, she didn't seem to see us, and she didn't respond to our questions. Amy immediately took her to hospital. During the trip to hospital, she regained alertness and was responding to questions. On admission to the emergency department, they wanted to weigh her. It was then that Amy discovered Mia had severe pain in her legs and could not stand. Mia was checked over again, and Amy was told there was a lot of influenza B going around, and that is probably what Mia had. The calf pain they labelled viral myositis, which is a common complication of influenza B. Mia was again sent home to rest. That night, I carried Mia to the toilet because she couldn't get there by herself. I knew she couldn't stand, but I was shocked by how much pain she seemed to be in. I called the hospital, wanting to speak to someone who had seen her earlier. That isn't something you can do, so I was instead transferred to a health advice line. I spoke to a nurse, explaining that we had taken Mia to a GP and in the hospital earlier that day, and been sent home, but I was still concerned. I told her that while Mia did seem more alert, her leg pain seemed worse. The nurse guided me through some checks, which included trying to move Mia's legs. She could hear Mia crying out in pain, and she asked if Mia had a tendency to be dramatic. I told her that the opposite was true, and Mia was normally very tough. When the call ended, we were still worried, but we felt our concerns had been heard without raising alarm. Amy slept in Mia's room that night and checked on her every 2 hours, prodding her to verify that she would react. The next day, Mia seemed to hold steady. She wasn't getting better, but she didn't seem worse either. We checked on her throughout the day, asking, "Are you okay?" And each time she responded, "I'm okay." Then Amy spotted a rash on Mia's legs. It blanched, but that didn't reassure us, so Amy took her back to hospital. When Amy got to hospital, a nurse noticed Mia while they were waiting in line. She recognized that Mia was very sick and immediately ushered Amy and Mia inside. Amy called me shortly afterwards, and I arranged for my aunt to look after her other children and went to hospital. I knew things were serious, but I was also trying to convince myself that everything was still somehow okay, that we'd be walking out of the hospital in an hour or two. When I walked into the room at the emergency department, I knew that wasn't true. Mia was surrounded by medical staff who all seemed very busy and very focused. Mia was clearly distressed both by the illness and by the nurse's attempts to add more IV lines to the ones she already had. The sound of her crying out in pain and fear in that room will be with me for the rest of my life. In ICU, they found room for me at the head of the bed where I could stroke Mia's hair and do my best to comfort her. She kept telling me that she felt better and she wanted to go home. But she wasn't better. A doctor told us that they needed to put her on a machine to help her breathe. We were told that intubation could be distressing to watch and we should wait elsewhere and come back when it was done. So we did as we were told. Amy went back first, and I remember her calling down the hall, "Peter, we're losing her." I ran in to see Mia again, surrounded by medical staff and a chest compression machine working to restart her heart. I can't describe the pain of that moment. I couldn't think. It just hurt. Thankfully, her heart started beating again. The next few days were terrible beyond my worst fears. I had never known it was possible to feel pain like I felt as I watched Mia lying still in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. Her hands and feet turned a dark purple colour, and we were told she may lose fingertips and toes. I found signing the consent forms to be a huge burden. I was supposedly giving informed consent to this procedure or that one. There was nothing informed about my consent. I just wanted them to save my daughter. Eventually I broke. I was given a form to sign and I couldn't do it. "What's the point?" I cried. "I don't understand any of it." I was left alone and Amy took over form signing duties. We felt a surge of hope when the ionotropes were reduced and there was an immediate improvement in the colour of her hands and feet. What followed was bittersweet. Even as we rejoiced to see her woken up, we grieved the loss of her fingertips, then her fingers, then her hands. The same creeping blackness also took her toes and then her feet. When we brought Mia back to hospital that Sunday, she was treated by dedicated doctors and nurses in the emergency department and PICU. There is no doubt that without their help, Mia would have died and will be forever grateful. When Mia was moved into the ward, the doctors and nurses were no less dedicated, but we quickly realised that hospital beds are in short supply. We felt pressured to book Mia in for amputation. We started to wonder if there were KPIs that had to be met. It felt like getting Mia out of hospital was a higher priority than giving her the best long-term result. On the 10th of November, Mia's arms were amputated below the elbow. The day afterwards, I was overcome with grief, not just because my daughter had lost her hands, but also because it happened without me being sure that it was the best that could be done. Mia was relying on me, and I had let myself get pushed into the operation before I felt certain. For her legs, we were initially told that Mia would have a through knee amputation. I could see the damage to her legs, but it looked to me like she had a lot left alive below the knee, so I asked whether her knees could be saved. I was told no. When I persisted, I was told that attempting to save her knees would be a mistake. I was told that often. I'm sure I was viewed as problematic by more than a few of the medical staff, but we sought advice from prosthetists and amputees, and the message came back loud and clear: save everything you can. The amount of stress we felt at that time was enormous. I remember being told, we need to think about what is best for Mia, as if maybe that wasn't the number one thing on my mind. We felt torn between what the hospital clearly wanted us to do and what we thought was best. Eventually, it was understood that we would not agree to a through-knee amputation before exploring every other option. We were going to wait, see how her legs were healing, and decide what to do later. On January 3, Mia's legs were amputated below the knee. I still felt grief, but this time I also felt happy and relieved. Amy and I had a glass of wine to celebrate Mia getting the best result possible. I wish we'd been given the same time for Mia's arms. I'll never know if Mia could have had a better result, if maybe a few extra centimetres could have been saved, and not knowing hurts. Today, Mia is learning to walk again on prosthetic legs and working to figure out her prosthetic arms. She smiles and laughs and tells us she loves us. I feel very lucky to still have her with us, because I know that for many the story is so much worse. But at the same time, I wish that I could have been luckier, that Mia could have been luckier. What hurts the most is knowing that what happened to Mia is preventable, or was preventable. We will go the rest of our lives knowing that if Mia had received treatment earlier, things would be different. I think of the symptoms Mia had when we sought help: rapid breathing, disorientation, fever, muscle pain, mottled skin, vomiting. They come straight off a sepsis awareness pamphlet, but we had never seen a sepsis pamphlet, and we didn't know. That's why it's important to increase public awareness. I asked specifically about meningitis because I'd been reached by the awareness campaign for it in Australia. Mia's treatment may have started much earlier if I had also known to ask, could it be sepsis? Equally important to raising the awareness of the public is increasing the awareness of the health professionals that we go to for help. We didn't know about sepsis, but we do know Mia. And as with many other sepsis stories, we knew something wasn't right. That feeling led us to seek medical help, not once, not twice, but 3 times on the day before Mia was admitted to ICU. I remember how quick they were to reassure us that nothing was out of the ordinary. Oh yes, there's a lot of this going around at the moment. Fever is a good thing. We don't worry about the actual temperature anymore. It's just a number. She can't be in too much pain if she has fallen asleep. I think there should be more formal, measurable tracking of the concern expressed by patients and their families. People express themselves in different ways, and it can be hard to gauge how someone you have just met is feeling. There's an existing method for dealing with this for determining pain levels, which is to ask patients to rate their pain from 1 to 10. I think you would get some very useful data if all patients were asked at presentation, on a scale of 1 to 10, how worried are you? How many times have you sought help for this? This data should be recorded because it comes from the person most familiar with the patient. Asking the question also gives the treating physician an immediate insight into the mind of the patient. If someone says they are a 9 out of 10 on the worry scale, it prompts the question, why? How is this different to other times? When we seek help, we need someone to listen to what we have to say. If you start with the assumption that the person you are treating just has the flu, you will be right most of the time. But if you start by asking, could it be sepsis? You may save their life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. There's so much of what you've said resonates with my own experience. and I'm sure with the others on the panel. You know, being that this is so recent, it's we're so grateful that you're able to speak about it. It took me years, almost a decade, to even begin to talk about my own experience. I have watched the video, and I can see that Mia will live a fruitful and a happy life in spite of what has happened. And the guilt part of it is also part of the equation. My wife struggled with guilt for years because she went through the same experience of medical health providers, ambulance driver, saying he's going to be okay. We've already seen him. And she just did not push it as hard as she felt she should have, which resulted in many, many complications in my own life. So I hope that Mia will get the help that she needs. You know, in the situation that Mia is in, she's more likely to get help than those of us who have what I would say hidden problems, like, you know, the cognitive problems or the fatigue, the depression that go along with sepsis. Peter, is there any other observations or comments that you would like to share with us? I think at this point, Katja, you can open the mic to the panelists, and we can have an open discussion with all concerned. There's, at this point, not really a lot of questions or comments on the chat line, but I welcome people. Here's your opportunity. Send in your questions or comments, and we'll talk to the panel about them. Okay. So why don't we just, we have about 10 minutes left in the session, and just like to invite, perhaps we'll start in the order that we've done with Carl first, since he did the first presentation. Carl, your thoughts on what you've heard?
Yeah, thanks, Ray. You know, listening to these stories, it's just incredible to me. And again, I mentioned this before, there's no way to measure the emotional burden that sepsis brings. The heartache, the decades of, oh my gosh, sorrow. We've got to do more. I mean, everyone has to do more. It's so devastating to hear all these stories. Strength to you all.
Fiona, would you like to carry on, or anything you'd like to say about the other presenters?
I'm extremely emotional after hearing Peter's presentation. I'm really proud of him for the amazing job that he just did. I think you all probably heard the emotion in my voice during my presentation when I talked about my passion and my drive for advocacy for sepsis, and hearing stories like what Mia, Peter and Amy and their other children have been through is just a huge reminder of why I do what I do.
Thank you so much, Peter, and the others for your inspiring stories. And well, I think it's still so important. We should be our own ambassadors. I often say to clients when it comes to aftercare, be your own ambassador. You have to be, because there's no organized aftercare for dealing with your mental problems, your physical problems. It's a lot of grieving what you have to do because you lost the person you were before. And that aspect doesn't get much attention either, the mental aspect. And it must be so hard for Peter to see his daughter and struggling, and yeah, I can only imagine what it must be like. But I think when it comes to aftercare and when it comes to early recognition of sepsis, we can't tell it enough and spread the word and sound the alarm bells. And I hope in Holland we can make steps in a good direction when it comes to that. And, well, sometimes stories like the story Peter just told can bring something about, you know, in the government, and that things may start to change. And well, I really hope that may be of some comfort to you, Peter.
Yeah.
That things may perhaps change a bit.
I'm not sure if I'm meant to respond or not. But that's certainly my hope. Yeah, I mean, change is what we're hoping for. It's what happened to Mia is terrible, but we are lucky in comparison to so many others who would wish for what we have because they lost their child. Mia will have challenges, but she's here to face those challenges, and we're grateful for that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that I'd just like to read a couple of comments from the chat line. I think that all of the stories here, I agree, are totally inspiring, and the story of Mia is certainly right at the top of the list in terms of the people who are participating and listening. And the courage of all of you in telling and sharing your stories is so important for the healthcare and other listeners to hear about this and realize the profound nature of how sepsis changes people's lives. We have a comment from a high school student in Atlanta whose father died from sepsis. We have another comment about how moving and incredible the presentations are. And I think realization in many of the comments of how healthcare professionals have to coordinate their activities both before, during, and after sepsis to deal with this, I would say, serious medical, I would say almost emergency situation throughout the world. I think we have time for a last few comments from any panel members. If you wish to make any last remarks, and then we will have to close the session. Why don't we start, just jump in, and then I would like to end up with a thank you to those involved.
It's Fiona Raymond. I saw a question from an Australian emergency nurse that just asked, what do we think the research priorities you want to be focused on in research here? I won't address the question directly, but I will say to refer to the Australian Sepsis Network's website and have a look at the Stopping Sepsis, a National Action Plan that was published in March this year, and have a look at the recommendations there.
Just, Carl, I'd like to make a comment too. When I went over to the WHO meeting and they did the world resolution, 194 countries, the thing that hit me between the eyes was a slide that someone put up that was prevention of infection is prevention of sepsis. So we have a cure. That's prevent the infections. So we need to get this early. We all look at the end game and treating it when it's that far gone. But I just can't get over how much that moved me. What? If you don't get infections, you won't get sepsis. Take care of everything. Vaccinations, hand hygiene. The slightest cut. So just want to leave, because it sure hit me. I want to leave that with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. Well, I'd like to. Sorry, go ahead. Do we have another comment?
I wanted to emphasize the sequelae people experience who weren't in the ICU. They too suffer from sequelae, and those problems should be addressed too. For those people, there isn't any aftercare whatsoever. So I'd like to put that in the spotlight as well. Sepsis is really a larger problem, a bigger problem than just post-ICU. So it really is a devastating disease. And when you can't return to your job because you have these neurocognitive impairments, that is really a loss and difficult to cope with too. So early recognition is the key to everything. And I recently I had a chat with someone who depends on IV nutrition, a young woman, and she gets sepsis every now and then. Can you imagine? So we can't always prevent sepsis because people are very, very vulnerable, but then we can invest in biomarkers that we can early detect sepsis in the blood and intervene as early as possible. So I wanted to say that to conclude.
Thanks, Idelette. And I'd like to, I think our time is up. And I'd like to thank all of you panelists, such an inspiring group of people, for sharing intimate stories and for doing what you are doing to help the awareness of sepsis spread throughout the world and not just the industrialized world. This is a wake-up call, I hope, to healthcare providers as well. I'd like to thank Marvin Zek and Katja Kubal and the technical staff for all the help for setting up the Congress and all the sessions in it. And a great thanks to Conrad Reinhardt, who is the chairman of GSA, and to all of the executives for their Herculean efforts over the years. It's been a privilege to be on the executive. And of course, this could not have happened without the sponsors for their contributions and for the volunteers who participated in this event. So with that, thanks to all, and good day, good night, wherever you may be.
God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All the strength for everyone.